Hello and welcome. We're going to give everyone another minute or so to join, and then we'll kick off. Okay, hello. Welcome to this LogPoint webinar. My name is Nils Krumrey. I'm a sales engineer in the UK, and I was going to take this hour to take you through LogPoint, both from a product perspective as well as what we are and what we are as a company. And then I'm going to take you through a bit of a product demo as well. So hopefully that'll be useful. If you have any questions at any time, please use the Q&A or chat functions, and we will have some time at the end to answer those questions. So you've probably seen information like this. There's a lot of reasons to deploy a SIEM. A key reason as to why customers are looking to deploy a SIEM solution is dealing with threats and protecting against incidents. The challenge that customers have is that they have a lot of information to protect, as well as a lot of information about that information, but they don't really know where to look. And in the end, that leads to this big issue, which is that it only takes a few minutes to compromise systems, in some cases at least, but it almost always takes a long, long time to detect those breaches. The biggest cause of that is the fact that there is information available, but it's really difficult to get hold of, especially when it matters, such as in the case of a breach. That's really where a SIEM comes in. It's helping you collect all of that information, store it somewhere centrally, keeping it accessible for when you need to access it, or to use that information proactively to maybe spot things before they happen, to increase security and reduce your risk. The biggest reason that customers always ask me about is we want one single pane of glass, that famous IT term. We're obviously probably quite bored of that nowadays, but a SIEM is probably the closest thing you're going to get to that dream of a single pane of glass. By having the central repository, it obviously makes a lot of things easier, such as finding breaches and investigating them. And by reducing the time, that has a lot of benefits in terms of workload, in terms of compliance with regulations, and so on. Increasingly, we're seeing interesting technologies deployed to make sense of all that information, one of that being our user entity and behavioral analytics. Some people call it artificial intelligence. We wouldn't go as far as that. It's machine learning, really, to find things, patterns in your logs, over and above just simple rules. But it's obviously then useful for other things. So while security is often the starting point, it by no means is the only reason why someone might use a SIEM. And in some cases, customers don't use it for security. They use it for one of those other reasons, but often it's a combination of all of them. So I've alluded to compliance. There's a multitude of reasons why a SIEM helps there. Firstly, you want to be able to produce that information when you're asked for it. Some specific rules and regulations maybe don't go as far as stipulating a SIEM exactly, but the capabilities they demand pretty much mean that you need a SIEM. Requirements around log management, log retention, and so on are often part of those. And then those logs can be from security devices, but they can obviously be from all sorts of other devices. And the most common one would be server logs, authentication logs, and so on. So that obviously has a benefit to IT operations. And they could be sharing the same data. They might be retrieving data for their own purposes. And often with our customers, security and IT operations are even the same people. So if you want to know when your server went down, or other operational things like that, then that's another use case. And then lastly, we see more of that now too, which is logs from things that aren't your traditional IT systems, or might at least be things like SAP or databases and so on, or indeed Salesforce. So ultimately, our SIEM at least is big data management. So if you have that big data available, you can visualize it and you can make sense of it, even if it isn't IT data. And that's where the business analytics would come in. So about LogPoint, I won't read all of these. There's more information on that on our website. We have quite a few customers now, but still mostly in Europe, although we have offices in Asia and in Boston in the US as well. So we see more there too. But the headquarters are in Copenhagen, and as far as I know, we're the only European SIEM vendor. And also, we are EL3 plus certified, which is not something that's important to most people, but it does mean that there are certain requirements, and there's auditing going on to make sure that we fulfill that security certification, and that our product is engineered in a way that is secure. You see on the top left that goes along with the Gartner Magic Quadrant. That's a recent Gartner term, advanced modern SIEM, which essentially is the combination of SIEM and UBA. We've been named a visionary in Gartner's Magic Quadrant this year, which we're quite proud of. Hopefully we will continue to build on that. But that's us in a nutshell. And obviously you can find out more about us in all sorts of places. One good one is Gartner's Peer Insights, which is, my colleague always calls it the TripAdvisor of software. So if you want to see what real customers have to say about LogPoint and how easy it is to work with us and to deploy the software, then do have a look in there. So in summary, the aim of LogPoint is really one singular thing, which is to make SIEMs easier. SIEMs have a bit of a reputation of being complicated and expensive, and you don't get the value out of it. And that's really the kind of thing that we want to change. And the two bits underneath are really how we do that. So firstly, our licensing has always been very straightforward and easy to understand, but also easy to predict, because we're not licensing based on the amount of data that you're ingesting. That has been a key pain point for customers of SIEM. There's a whole cottage industry around sending less data to your SIEM with other tools, which is a bit perverse in our mind. Of course, the more data you have, the more sense you can make of it, and the more value you should be getting out of it. So why penalize you for bringing in that data? So we license on the basis of nodes or devices sending us data. And because of that, it's much easier to at least understand in advance what you're dealing with, and how that might grow if you have an acquisition, or bring on another data center or so on, rather than having really crude estimates as to how much data that might be generating. And then lastly, we are very proud of our support, and most of our customers are very happy with it, both in terms of customer satisfaction, as well as in renewing with us. Support is a bit different to a lot of other vendors. It's not just about keeping lights on and supplying patches. It's about you getting value out of the solution. So if there is a device that we don't support, and increasingly there's fewer and fewer of those, but there's always something, then that is part of support to help you bring in that device and provide the normalization. I'll come back to that. But also, if you have queries around how to use the product, or I want to get this bit of information out of it, but I don't quite know how to write that, then that's something that they help you with too. So if we talk about the basic architecture of a SIEM and how you would be working with it. So the first important part is that you need to decide on the sources that you want to cover, i.e. the log data that you want to bring into the SIEM. And you can see here that there's quite a few in the background there. That's just the most common ones that we see our customers use. There's far more than that. There's about 430, I think, last I checked, built-in integrations that come out of the box. And as I've already mentioned regarding support, if there is something that's a commercial product that you can buy off the shelf, but we for some reason don't support, then all you need to do is to raise a support ticket and give us some examples of the log messages that that device generates, and then we will create a normalization for it. The key sources really are any kind of network device, switches, firewalls, VPN devices, load balancers, that kind of thing. And then any sort of authentication, usually Active Directory, whether that's Azure or on-premise. So those are the key ones that almost everyone wants to deploy. Anything security related, virus scanners, packet inspection, vulnerability scanners, that kind of thing as well. And then the sky's your limit. You can see on the right-hand side, we do support quite a few cloud sources by now. Office 365 is the biggest one. There are things like CloudTrail and CloudWatch and Amazon, Salesforce even, box auditing. So there's a few kind of more application-focused packages, also on-premise, and then also things like databases, kind of Oracle and SQL auditing, finding out who dropped the table and so on. So at that point, it's your creativity as to what gives you value. And that's a point I'd make. Don't just bring in logs for the sake of it. Always have in mind, what does that give you and what can you do with it? And then that kind of leads on to what you want out of it. That's usually how we look at the sources that you might bring in. There's a lot of technical ways of doing that. The most common one is still syslog. We can collect files from machines. As I said, we can reach out through cloud APIs. There are things like SFTP and SCP to kind of copy things onto our box and so on. So there's lots of ways of bringing in the logs. It largely depends on the device that it is. So in terms of how LogPoint gets deployed, and there's always questions around that, the point to make is that what you get from us is essentially a self-contained machine image. So that could be either deployed from an ISO, or it could be, in most cases, it is indeed a VM image, either an OVA or a VHD. And increasingly also we have customers that just deploy a machine up in Azure or AWS, and they get a link to a machine from us. And then that gets deployed and can take one of those 3 nodes that you see here, roles that you see here. So in some cases, customers just deploy one machine that does all of it. In other cases, they break it out, and I've got some examples. But essentially, that machine image then performs all those tasks. So firstly, a collection role, that's where those endpoints come in, or rather sources, including endpoints if need be. And they send information to that collector, and the collector then performs the normalization. So normalization is the process of turning those logs that always look different into the LogPoint language. And that's a key difference between us and lots of other SIEMs. We normalize the data when it hits LogPoint. So in the end, what you search is using the LogPoint language, and hopefully at that point, it doesn't really matter whether it was a Cisco or a Palo Alto or whatever firewall. It'll always be the same kind of fields, and I'll show you that in the demo. There's a lot of value in doing that. And then we enrich the data, which is adding things to the log that wasn't there originally. And that could be things like DNS information or an Active Directory lookup against the user ID that's in the log, or indeed threat intelligence. I'll show you that in the demo as well. Again, a lot of potential in that. We've got some customers that look up their asset management database to add things to the log as to what machine it is, who is it checked out to, what floor is it on. So there's a lot of creative uses for that. There's a routing policy, which determines where the data goes to get stored. How long it will be stored for example. There is also an opportunity to throw away log messages at that stage if you're really confident you don't need them. It's quite sophisticated. And then lastly, there's a data node that the data goes to live on. That could be the same machine, as I said, but it often is a different one. All that needs is storage, and in full transparency, often quite a lot of it. It entirely depends on how much data you have and how much your log data, how much your devices generate. So that's up to you to decide how long you want to keep the data for. One thing that we can do is you can provision different tiers of storage to that device, and there's storage tiering built in. So you can say, please keep this data on this storage for 30 days, and then we move it automatically on to another bit of storage. It does have to be file storage. It could be slow NAS or faster SSDs or whatever else, but it wouldn't be object storage, in case you're wondering that. Our data always stays online and searchable, so there's not really a concept of archive storage and so on. And then lastly, there is a search head, which is essentially the web interface and where the analytics run, the searches, the dashboards, the reports, and so on. So that's the basic LogPoint deployment. That's what you get with a core SIEM license. There are two other components that you might or might not be interested in. So firstly, there's Director. I won't say too much about that. It's mostly used by managed service providers or indeed by large multinational customers that have completely separate LogPoint deployments, but they want to monitor and manage them centrally. It's things like central license management, APIs to programmatically deploy LogPoint servers and so on. So very powerful, but standard commercial customers probably don't need it. And then the second feature, which we will talk about a bit more in a second, is UEBA. And a lot of our customers now do take that up. That is pretty much the only separate license that we sell. So that's why I break it out. And you'll also see the word cloud there. So the way that works is to take the data that we have in the SIEM, hash it and encrypt it with a key that's held in your LogPoint machine and only there, and then send up certain values into our cloud analytics. And there we run machine learning models. And all we see really then is the encrypted and hashed values. We don't really know that it's Bob. We only know it's 7341. And then we send those statistics essentially back to your LogPoint box, and that then visualizes that for you, and you can do all sorts of things with that. But that's something that you don't need to stand up your infrastructure for. We take care of that for you, because it's one of those things where there's bursts of lots of activity and then nothing. It's another stumbling block that people had in deploying machine learning productively with other SIEMs. Having to size that and so on is really difficult, so that's why we turned it into a cloud service. Just a brief example of the different ways you can deploy these LogPoint images. So as I said, you can have one image, you can have multiple ones of these, they can be in multiple locations. A collector often is deployed if you have multiple network locations. You don't want to send all the data directly over the network. You don't want to open syslog ports from your machines out there or something like that. So you can put a collector there. Or indeed, if you have multiple big sites, maybe you have a storage node there too, and then the searches run largely local and everything else gets retrieved over the network. So they are all options. There is no license cost to having more of these. And in fact, we often advise to just start with one box, get a handle on where is your main data, and then people start branching out over time and bring on additional sites and so on. You can do that, and you don't really need to tell us, because you can just deploy more machines. So that was the core SIEM functionality. Just a quick word on UEBA, and it's probably best explained in the demo as well. UEBA stands for User Entity Behavioral Analytics. It's not our invention, that term, as you can imagine. But the idea is that if we have all that log data sitting in a SIEM, why don't we use that to give you more insight into what's going on there. And the way we do that is with machine learning and essentially behavioral models. And the reason why we've introduced that is because of this guy here, which I very much like. And the question that we get a lot, and again, a stumbling block to the deployment of SIEMs. We have all this data now in a SIEM, but what do we do with it? I don't have time every day to check this. I don't have time to spend 3 hours proactively hunting for threats in there. I need something that tells me when something happens. And that is a challenge. There is obviously larger customers that have entire SOCs with hundreds of analysts, and for them that's really easy. They can afford that cost. But most customers, they are only starting on this journey for SIEM. And while there's a few things that they can do proactively, it really helps them to have something else that might tell them things they didn't see coming. So what does UBA do? It's essentially trying to find behavioral abnormalities in your log data that might align to one of these stages of a cyber attack. And that's the nature of attacks nowadays. They're not just single events that happen and there's a firewall port that gets accessed, and as we see communication on that, that means there's a breach. That's kind of the old world of perimeter security. It doesn't quite work like that anymore, because that's probably happening hundreds of times a day, just because someone works with some kind of cloud source, or indeed there might be some malicious insider where all your external firewall security won't make any difference. So the way to spot that is finding these breadcrumbs that get left behind by these attacks. And they don't often happen just in one place either. Something gets breached, then something gets infected, and something gets pivoted and staged and so on. So that does show up, but it doesn't show up in a single way and in a single place that someone can easily spot. So by running these behavioral models, we create a baseline over a certain period of time. We usually say wait 30 days, so you have a few weekends under your belt, and determines what does an individual user do, and what do other users that are a bit like him do, and how does what we see now differ from that. And I'll show you the example and how that actually looks in the product. And that then builds this picture of little things that are all a bit weird in certain places that, in summary, are so strange that you should know about them. And then you can use that information also if you do somehow have this smoking gun and you see, yes, something has been breached. But what would the next step be without UBA? You kind of have to troll back through all those logs and somehow tie these things together and find out, who did it, where did they come from, and so on. Whereas with UBA, you can use this information retrospectively to see, okay, so I know this was breached, but what was beforehand that was unusual? And you can kind of work it out that way and hopefully either mitigate the damage or prevent it from happening again. And I've mentioned about the cloud service for UBA. That is generally trying to address this issue that customers have with SIEMs, that it takes a long time to deploy and tune, and costs a lot of money. The way we do it for the core SIEM is by including all these pre-packaged dashboards and reports and vendor packages. And for UBA, we obviously do it as a cloud service, so you don't have to deal with the deployment, which in summary means that most customers get some value out of LogPoint in 5 days or so. And that's not just an exaggerated term. That's our aim, that you deploy LogPoint, and after a week or so, you have at least something there that gives you something you didn't have before. I wouldn't say that you have a fully operational SIEM and all the alerting is in place and all that. That is something that does take time, and unfortunately we can only do so much to address that. But at least it's not something that just sits on the shelf for 6 months while you're planning the deployment. I'm a big fan of learning by doing. So once you have it up and running and we've done some knowledge transfer, which we normally do as part of our 5-day deployment process, you should have the tools at your fingertips to really at least start using it productively and building it out. And that was it in terms of slides. Hopefully that was useful and not too boring. And I'll switch to my demo environment and show you some of this in action. So hopefully you can see that all right. That's the LogPoint web interface. Usually what you are greeted with, which is the LogPoint dashboard. And you can see, to kind of refresh just now, you can see certain information visualized for you in what we call widgets. So each widget is a representation of the data underneath. Most of these come pre-built. So this, for example, is a dashboard that's pre-built for Active Directory authentication. You can see the other dashboards here. Again, for demo purposes, we have quite a lot of them. Most customers probably only end up with one in the end. They might create a new one, and you can take these and drag and drop them from multiple different dashboards. You can resize them. You can change how you want to, see them, if it makes sense or not. By doing that, you can use our pre-built dashboards, see what they visualize for you for the different devices that you bring in, and then create your own that you might actually have on a big screen, or you do check when you log into LogPoint once a week or something like that. The vendor packages that we have, most of them come with something like this. They often also come with a report and so on. So again, the idea being that you get something out of the box without having to create it all from scratch for the data that you have. So this is one of the big use cases, authentication in all its forms. Who's failing to log in, who keeps locking themselves out, what's the reason for their login failure, and so on. There's quite a lot of information about the privileged accounts and so on there. So you can imagine how this is useful operationally, but also how this already has a security angle to it too. Because if you have something like this and you know how this normally looks, and then suddenly on a Sunday night, 2 a.m., you can see that spiking, maybe something did happen that you didn't expect. You can take that to Active Directory, same kind of idea, but in this case, it's who's creating users, who's deleting users, is there anything untowards, and you can see how that breaks out over time. There's different ways of looking at that data that I'll come back to. Maybe critical users, things like passwords that never expire, dollar signs to hide the user, making changes to the administrator group, and so on. So that's kind of authentication. There's a lot of value in that. Some customers have separate tools for that they don't technically need because it's all in the Windows logs. But that's something that a SIEM can help with. It's just a good example of kind of visualizing the data. The next big area that I've already mentioned previously is networking in all its forms. And this is a relatively simple dashboard. You can see how it's the connections in a firewall, what gets denied, what gets allowed. Is there connection temps between different zones? That might be a PCI requirement. If you have air-gapped environments, maybe you want to keep that separate and you want to see who's trying that on. Maybe also that communication happens somewhere. So that's a good point about SIEMs, because you can collect these logs from all sorts of places. There might be an assumption that your firewall stops some traffic, but actually shows up in the log somewhere else. And that could be an indication that your firewall doesn't log it, or it doesn't block it and the traffic goes somewhere else. So, it's always worth keeping an eye on these kind of things if that's what you want to avoid, just by running a search against that, for example. This dashboard, I said it's generic, and it works because it works against the normalized values. There's dashboards for every vendor, as I said, and every vendor does something special in their logs. There might be things in there that aren't very universal, but at least there will be a source destination, source address, destination address. There will be a port. There will maybe be a protocol, and so on. And we try to normalize that. Therefore, that dashboard should probably work against all of them. So that's kind of basic networking. You can also do things like NetFlow data if you're really interested in, what's the actual traffic between nodes and so on. But if you take it a step further, this is threat intelligence, which is a form of enrichment, as I mentioned earlier. So if we have all of those logs, why don't we compare that to certain lists of indicators of compromise? And you can see some examples here. At the moment, we're just loading Proofpoint, emerging threats, but there's Critical Stack as well. That's a popular one that's free, community-based, and there's a few others that you can pay for. Recorded Future is pretty cool. All that is essentially long lists of IPs, of hashes, of domain names, and so on that are known in the world to be bad. If we have that list, why don't we check whether anyone in your network is communicating with them, or indeed they are communicating to you? You can see here there's some that get flagged, such as a malware command and control server. Hopefully, in your case, this would all be empty. But if we know that, then we can have a look at it and who's communicating with that. And again, your firewall might be doing something like that itself, but it's always good to have a second pair of eyes. And to us, it doesn't matter where the log came from. Even if it's Windows log, it will have an IP in there, so we can check that against that list of threats. If you have something more sophisticated, by all means, bring it in. So this is a vulnerability scanner, for example, and it's something that we don't do because we're a SIEM vendor. There's other tools out there that do all sorts of cool things on network security, but it is a really interesting data source for us, because if you have that information, you can correlate that with maybe your alerts. Maybe you don't need to know if something communicates on a specific port, unless we also know it's vulnerable, and that information would be coming from Nessus. And you can see how that starts building up a picture that you can then tailor to what you're interested in and what you want to know about in your environment. And that's really the power of a SIEM, that you can use these different data sources and bring them all together. So I've talked a bit about the dashboard. One point to make about all of these is that they are essentially a glimpse into the data that's held behind the platform. If we look at that information, you can see in the details here that there's always a search behind it. So each of these widgets is essentially a search against the platform, and that search language is the same all across LogPoint. So that's also where the flexibility of a SIEM comes in. So while they look pre-built, you can make changes to them just by changing the search behind it. That's what usually happens once you deploy the standard dashboards and you see the data coming in. You look at it and you kind of go, okay, yeah, good start, but I need to see this just for my groups of users in this office. Yeah, of course, this includes the public Wi-Fi. We're not interested in what's going on there. That's all firewalled off. And then suddenly you want this, but you want it changed a little bit. And that's where the search comes in. And you can make a change and say, okay, group equals and so on, and do that. If you want to ever check what the data is that powers this, you can hit this little search button and it'll take you to the LogPoint search platform, which, as you can see here, is one of those big areas. You can dive in further and see the data underneath. Just to explain that search language, it sometimes scares people away, but really isn't difficult. And it's not even as complicated as a SQL query. It usually is kind of a key and a value pair. So, if you want any source address, it's source_address equals star. Also, you can then use these bits behind that pipe that's there to visualize it. So that's how it creates this little beautiful thing. And that's, if you change that screen, it really looks like it does on the dashboard. It is the same thing. So if we dive in a bit further, you can see how those log messages look underneath and how you would work with that data interactively. So this is always down here, the raw log message, as we call it. So we always store that. That's the message that came from the device. And in fact, you can search through that as full text. If you're ever in doubt as to what we've normalized, you can find it in here. But we also turn it into LogPoint language, and that's up here. The LogPoint taxonomy, and you can see certain field names that we've taken out of this message. And this is a relatively simple log message. It's almost like full text, but it does actually make it quite difficult to chop it up in this way. There's other log formats and so on. I'll show you that in a second. They look completely differently, but they all end up in this LogPoint language. So if I do that, actually, if I take that and just do an asterisk and search through everything. So firstly, you'll see this is where SIEM comes into its own, how it counts up these, millions of logs potentially, and it searches through quite quickly. And then also you can see the different log formats. So this is a Windows log that obviously looks completely different. But you will hopefully be able to spot certain fields up here that are similar to the original one. For example, there was an object in there. Obviously, there's a lot of things in here that are Windows specific, but the things that are the same get normalized in the same way. And that's how you can then search through by saying things like source_address, and then your source address, and it doesn't find that in every single log. And you can also spot something else that we like to do with the log messages that we understand. No one knows what Windows Event ID 4625 is. Well, some people do, I don't. But we add these labels that you can use to search through. That's how we know, okay, that means this was a failed interactive user logon. And you can see it here. This comes from Trend Micro. And you can see that was a file detection that also quarantined the file, obviously ICAR. That really makes it much easier to work out what was going on, or maybe quickly exclude everything that was false and so on, because you can use those labels to search through. On the left-hand side, you get a breakdown of everything that we found and the different values that we found. That's really useful as well, because you can see 698,000 logs. No one's going to go through them. But maybe you are interested in a specific source port. So these were the specific source ports that we found. Or this was the user fields that we had in these 700,000 logs, the different actions that were seen. And okay, so maybe I'm only interested in the created. That is me with the source address up here. So now we only have anything that had action created. That was all the directory objects. So now you can see here, okay, so that was accounts and that was groups, that was users, that was hosts. So maybe I'm just interested in this host. And you can kind of piece together your queries like that, and that makes it really easy to work with that way. There's other things on there with those little chevrons. Sometimes you can do DNS lookups and so on, some built-in functionality. There's a virus total integration. If you see a hash, maybe you just send that to virus total to see what that is and so on. Once you have built your searches, you can use them in other places. So for example, from here, you can turn them straight back into a dashboard widget. If you want to visualize that in the future, maybe you have narrowed it down to things that are really important to you, or aggregated somehow, you want to see it on the dashboard. Also, crucially, if you have something that's very specific, you can say, okay, take this and turn it into an alert, please. So now I need to know about this when it happens again. And a few other things that you can do straight from here. So that's the nice thing. Although there is a bit of a learning curve to the search, once you've kind of worked that out, you can use it everywhere. And the way to learn about it is, there's multiple ways of doing that. The best way I find is to look at what's pre-built and then starting to make that your own. That's what most customers do. And that's why it's really important to have all this pre-built information available, the dashboards, reports, and so on. You look at it and you kind of go, oh, that's interesting. I did that for a firewall. I can do that for Windows accounts, no problem. And you can start working with that. For those people that don't do this on a daily basis, there might be people in your business or indeed yourself. There's one other thing that we have, which is called a search template, and that's also really useful. That's essentially taking those searches, but making them look like a dashboard, and making them much easier to work with on an ongoing basis. So if you look at this threat hunting dashboard, that's a nice looking one. You can see on the right-hand side, there's all sorts of things that I can fill in. But if I hit update with asterisk, I get the entire breakdown. This is like a dashboard, but it's populated with these values on the right-hand side that I have control over. These can come from different locations and different sources and are different things to show you, but they're all driven by this. So what normally happens is that you're not interested in all of this. It gets a bit messy with all these different things. What you're interested in is Christopher. So you hit update and it brings you all of this back. Now for Christopher. So you can see that that's the address he came from, that's the hashes he's worked with, this is the activities that he's done, login activity, what devices have we seen him connect to, all sorts of things driven by the log data. And you can imagine how you can do this against any data source. One common example is group management. So if we look at the group management dashboard, you can see what's happened to my Active Directory groups. And I want to know what happened to the finance group, so I punch in finance. I hit update and it draws it for me just for the finance group, and you can see, okay, these members have been added and removed. This is what happened, how often, and this is who did it. Demo data, a bit dodgy, happening a lot, but you get the idea. That's useful for operations. There are examples of customers giving that to their HR team, that at the end of employment, they just need to check that the account has been disabled. They can create a dashboard with that particular search. That's all the user has access to. They can punch that in themselves. So that's how we think that having a SIEM is not just a time sink, You can also save time by having a SIEM. And hopefully by doing this, you save time on trawling through log sources. Someone has to open a support ticket in IT. Some IT team member needs to compile all of that, export it to a CSV, attach it to an email. Instead, the users that need this, they can just self-service, and you can spend that time to do more productive things, such as hunting for threats or improving your security somehow. That's why we think those search templates are really powerful, and you don't then need to know the LogPoint search language either. Obviously, to build it, you do, but not to use it. So that's the search and the dashboards, that so far has been largely driven proactively by the administrator. So they log in, they look at things, they try to search for things, visualize it, work with it interactively. But not everyone does that at all times or has the bandwidth to do it. So the next big question then is, how do I do this so I get told? And that's where alerts come in, and incidents as well. And I've mentioned how everything in LogPoint is a search, and that's true for alerts as well. So if we look at the alert rules as they are defined, there's something called vendor rules. That's always the pre-built stuff. And there's 28 pages worth of that for specific things. And if we look at certain bits of information, and let me see, is there some Office 365 somewhere? There we go. So there's some Office 365 alerts that you can turn on. Let me search for Office. There we go. So that's all of them. I would strongly not recommend ticking all of this and just turning all of that on. That's tempting, but it's also one of those things that people struggle with when they deploy a SIEM, because these are just starting points. Some of these are useful out of the box. But then there are some that you probably want to think about and use as a starting point for your own. So this one, for example, files downloaded in OneDrive. You probably don't want that on for everything, but you might want to make that change, and maybe only for certain users, maybe the ones on the blacklist, or for certain locations, maybe the ones that you define. And that's really the idea, that you can use these as starting point for things that really matter to you. This is a good example of how that then looks. Has data been copied to a USB stick? For some customers, that's really useful and can be used like that. If they block their USB sticks, you don't want to see that ever. But if you don't block USB sticks, then you obviously get that all the time. So what you do is you look at the query that drives this, and you can see how that's relatively easy. Again, event category removable storage, access write data, access append data. So that's what we're looking for in any Windows log that might come from an endpoint. And that's what most customers then go and say, oh, user in blacklist. Maybe make a change to it like that. That might be a table or a list that you have defined with that information, or certain lists of machines and so on. So you make it your own, and then you can enable that. And then what happens is twofold. It creates an incident in the incident management, but also there's this little doorbell icon you can set for individual alerts, so that they might go external. So some of the things you can do is obviously send an email is still a classic, and we use that often to have email to case. If you have a third-party case management system that your help desk normally works in, why is it not sent that way? But you can also do things like run a REST query against an URL. We have a customer that's using that to raise things in Slack. SSH notification if you want to run a script. So there's some potential there to automate certain things. Writing that script would be up to you, but we can give it parameters from the log that we work with, and that might be useful in creating kind of external automation for very specific things, maybe like disabling a user account when something really bad happens, that kind of thing. But then also, these get raised as incidents. At LogPoint, there's a whole platform for that, where you can see this with certain criticality. That's defined by you, and that's the information that gets populated kind of into the alerts. You can have this owned by specific users in LogPoint. There's obviously user account control in LogPoint that you can log in as different users integrated with LDAP and so on. And they can maybe have an alert assigned to them. They can work on it, can escalate it, close it off, that kind of thing. And you can do that in here. And if you look at the instant data, you have control over what goes into that, but maybe that shows you, these fields that were part of that alert. You can always click on the view data as well, if you want to see exactly what this was the query that we had earlier. So you can see this was 77 logs of that type that led to that alert. That's the event category. This is the raw log, and these are the messages and so on. You can look at what that was. So really useful. That obviously then gets triggered rather than you having to look for it. And then it's up to you to deal with those incidents. Then the final piece of the puzzle is you want this every Monday morning. You want a summary of what happened, or you want to know how much storage you're using, or whatever else it might be. And that's where the reports come in. Similar concept. There's a lot of pre-built reports, if we look at those. Some are device specific, such as Office 365 reports. There's an Oracle one, Office 365 Firewall. Some are aligned to certain bits of regulation. There's quite a few of those pre-built as well for GDPR and PCI and so on. And I'd be lying to tell you that you run these reports, you're ISO compliant, but it's what other people have asked for. It's what they've used to demonstrate their compliance, something that you might be interested in for specific things, and then you run that as your own report and maybe make changes to it. Once the report has run, it ends up in the inbox. You can have a look at it. If we look at something like this, is a GDPR file access report, because we think that matters to GDPR. There's often a bit of a text in there as to what the regulation says, as to why we think this matters, and then we break that down in various forms, pie charts or lists and so on, a bit like on a dashboard, but obviously in a longer paper-based report if that's what you want. Those reports can be modified in various ways. So firstly, there is obviously a look and feel to it that you can change, put your own logo on it and so on. But also, crucially, if you look at how these reports are defined, they're just sequences of queries again. And you can literally go in and select those searches. These are the ones that I just did. So you can select that and then have it in a report. So that makes it really nice and easy to create your own reports. And it's another pain point that often exist with other SIEMs, that you can only do what's pre-built, or you've got external tools that you need to use and exporting into CSVs and all sorts of things. You don't normally need to do that. You can just piece them together like that. There's even a little layout engine there that you can use if you want to, insert a page break. This is where the text comes in. I want another panel now, and I want it to be 3, and I want it to be that wide, and then I have that kind of search here and there's there and so on. So it's really nice and easy that way. And that's pretty much the basic SIEM functionality. Obviously, there's a lot of things you can do once you dive into the search and the different data sources and so on. But at least in terms of the tools that you're given, that's kind of, I hope, a decent overview. The only thing left to discuss is UBA. I've kept that to the end, even though it is very well integrated. But it is a separate license, so I didn't want to confuse anyone about what's included and what isn't. So if we're talking about UBA, I've explained on how it works. You can see these are the events that we've analyzed, 120 million of them, and we found some anomalies in there, including 3 that we actively consider risky at the moment. You can see these are the models that got triggered and the categories they're in. So there's a lot of lateral movement going on lately, and in any good demo, the risk goes up at the end. But you can see how that developed over time, and it's quite high risk at the moment. So if we look at what that actually means in practice, you can see for a specific day here, you can filter on it. There's certain activity that was considered low risk, but there's also a cluster here of activity that's considered high risk. And if we just filter on that, you can see that there's one entity, one user that stands out with a really high risk score, Joshua Newman. It's worth pointing out that risk score is not something that someone dreamt up and configured. And some UBA platforms work like that, where you kind of have to say a login is 17. This is based on how far removed from himself and others is this behavior. So how unusual is it? And that's what that risk score arrives at. So we can see there's this activity here in a nice little timeline that Joshua performed. And that's a good example on why this is different to a regular SIEM alert. So this is the hour in which this happened. It highlights the challenges with a regular SIEM alert. There's a lot of use in a regular SIEM alert, but you need to know in advance what you to look for. Would you create an alert like that, working hour of any activity? Probably not. You wouldn't even think of it. But even if you wanted to, how would you define it? Is it anything that doesn't happen between 9 and 5 p.m.? And then that's where the false positives start, because Joshua is one of those people that's working late in the evening normally. Maybe he's in a different time zone, or he just is a late shift worker, and especially lots of people are working from home. This is probably not a really good indication, at least not on a static rule like 9 to 5. UBA, however, works this out for every user by running those models, which otherwise would be a massive task for you to do yourself. So for Joshua, him working in the morning is a bit unusual. But still, you wouldn't want to have an alert on this, because, as I said, he might just be on holiday, or be a bit restless, or something like that. It probably happens all the time. But it's a bit unusual for him, and it's one of these breadcrumbs on that journey of the potential attack. So not something that should be completely ignored, but something that needs to be dealt with differently than just single alarm bells going off. And that is exactly what happened. Same time, different data source, this happened. And this came from a web proxy log. And that's the strength of a SIEM. We have all these logs. So there's great security tools, but very few of them look at all of this at the same time and correlate them. So same time, Joshua sent 1.3 gigabytes using a post request. And that's a really unusual way of sending lots of data. Maybe someone attaches a cat photo to an email in a web client, but they wouldn't send 1.3 gigabytes using post. And that's unusual, not only for him, because the most he's ever sent is 30 megs that way, but also everyone else. No one ever has sent that much data. So that in itself would be quite unusual. And that's what then adds up to this risk score. Lots of these things happening all at the same time, lots of data ownership changes or something like that. And that's why there's a high risk associated with this user. These kind of things, you can always hit raw events and you dive straight back into the search platform. So the UBA is just another enrichment source for LogPoint. It's still the same log data, but it will be enriched with who was the user and what was their risk score at the time, and what was the model that was triggered potentially with this log message. And you can look at it from other points of view as well, which is quite useful. So if we look at it from a share point of view, there's a share that Joshua was very active in. So that has a bit of a risk now, because he was active 38 times an hour, whereas normally he only accesses it 1 or 2 times an hour. Similar thing if you're monitoring certain servers. Is there someone suddenly has lots of failed login attempts, previously only failed logging in once. Or is there suddenly 30 user accounts all trying to log into a server that they've never logged into before? So you can imagine how there's a lot of these things that you could actually spot if you knew what to look for. And that's where these hundreds of machine learning models come in that we've built for these data sources that analyze that kind of behavior and hopefully tell you about these things. And you then can either take action or at least after the fact work out what actually happened. So good data sources for that are, again, authentication. You've seen some in action, web proxy logs, VPN logs. There's quite a few things that we support, even printer logs, if someone kind of prints stuff out, and attacks have happened that way. Obviously, this only works for sources that we know about beforehand. So if you do bring in a custom log source, UBA wouldn't be able to determine anything in that. But because we use the normalization in LogPoint, UBA actually has support for quite a lot of different vendors. So which firewall vendor you use to a large extent doesn't matter. So it's quite flexible that way. The focus at the moment, at least, is pretty much security. So again, it wouldn't tell you that your server is suddenly far more active than normal, or suddenly the disk space usage is exploding, that kind of thing. Nice idea, not what we're focusing on at the moment, maybe one day. And in terms of how this is licensed, we license it on the entities that you are watching over. So an entity pretty much is either a user or a server. So if you are monitoring 200 people, that would be 200 entity licenses. If you are watching over your Exchange server and your file server, that would be 2 entities. So that's how we do it. It does mean that you don't have to license everyone. So some customers get scared. They have 15,000 users and they worry that they need to buy 15,000 UBA licenses. You can start with a subset and you can define who those people are. And one way to do it is maybe your administrator accounts that have higher access levels, or all your contractors that are potentially higher risk, that kind of thing. So you don't have to start with everything at once. Okay, So I wanted to leave some time for questions. So hopefully that was useful. And we have got about 5 minutes, I think. So if you have any questions, I'll go through the Q&A. And otherwise, already, thank you for watching.